Covering this shooting throughout the day, we've had a few viewers with the very same question.
Yeah, several of you have asked what qualifies as a mass shooting. Well, here's Victor Puente with the answer to that good question.
One of the issues with reporting on a shooting like the one we had early this morning in Lexington is there is no official definition of a mass shooting. Different resources have different criteria. For example, in a report on public mass shootings, the Congressional Research Service only listed shootings involving 4 or more deaths, not including the shooter. The FBI calls an active shooter 1 or more people actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a public area. We use the definition established by the Gun Violence Archive. CBS News, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal all cite that resource. The archive says a mass shooting has a minimum of 4 victims shot, either injured or killed, not including the shooter. They do say that there are multiple types of mass shootings, including public shootings, bar or club incidents, what they call family annihilations, drive-bys, and workplace incidents. So by that definition, a mass shooting doesn't have to be premeditated, but it does have to impact multiple people with an act of violence. If you have a good question, just email us. Goodquestion@WKYT.com. I'll see you on WKYT Mornings.